Good afternoon, everybody. This is Eric Stites with Franchise Business Review, and I am so excited today to have with me today a very special guest, Loren Feldman, founder and chief writer extraordinaire at 21hats.com. Welcome.
Oh, Eric, thanks so much. It's an honor to be here.
It was, I was thinking about doing today's interview with you, and I realized that you were the first non-franchise person that I've interviewed in the last 16, 17 years.
Then I'm really honored.
Business Review. So yeah. So basically, for those that may not know Loren, you have 2 decades worth of experience with some really amazing publishers in business content organizations, from Forbes, Inc., Fast Company. I know you've even written for New York Times. You've really spent the last 2 decades of your life exploring entrepreneurship and small business ownership and at many different levels. I mean, I'm so curious to kind of hear your story of after going through that process and then telling us a little bit about your current project with 21 Hats and how that all got started. So give us a little bit of the background and tell us a little bit about 21 Hats.
Sure, happy to. Well, I had been working for newspapers and magazines previously. I tended to focus on business coverage, but truth to tell, I knew nothing about entrepreneurship or business ownership. It was only in 2002 that I got my job at Inc. magazine. And it was kind of a fluke. A friend of mine was named editor of the magazine. He needed some help at the very beginning figuring out what he was doing with the magazine and asked me to help out on kind of a part-time basis. The magazine was based in Boston. I was living in New Jersey, but I spent a few days a week in Boston helping him out. And one thing led to another, and 20 years somehow passed, and I never left.
Just like that.
Yeah, it was kind of just like that. I fell in love with it. I fell in love with the other people who worked at the magazine who really knew entrepreneurship and kind of took me under their wing and taught me most of what I know today. And I loved meeting business owners and entrepreneurs. And, the topic just was completely new to me, completely fresh. And I loved the puzzle solving, the problem solving of figuring out which businesses are going to make it and, how to overcome certain problems. So I did it at Inc. for a few years. I went to New York Times for a few years. I went to Forbes for a few years. I had a great experience at each of those publications. I worked with really smart people, learned a lot. But over the time, I came to think that there was kind of a hole in the market, that there wasn't enough coverage being given to kind of more traditional everyday businesses. We in the media have tended to focus, in my opinion, a little bit too much on the glamour businesses, the Silicon Valley and venture-backed businesses.
The unicorns.
Exactly. And, heaven knows they deserve to be covered. And those stories can be great, whether the company succeeds or whether they fail. Those are great stories. But there's a whole other world out there that doesn't always get the attention it deserves. And that's what I wanted to focus on. So I left to try and build kind of a community for those businesses, a community, and a platform where we would create content, podcast, newsletter, articles, but also try to get people to participate and share their information, share their wins and losses. And that's what I'm working on.
Nice. Awesome. So I'm curious, obviously you've heard the good, the bad, the ugly of entrepreneurship and ownership for years. When you started thinking about, starting your own business, how scared were you?
What do you mean were? It's scary. And, it's funny because having done this as many years as I have talked to a lot of very smart people, and I've learned through them, not through my own experience. And I've shared what I've learned through them. And, one of the things I've learned is that a lot of businesses tend to be overly cautious in their pricing. So it's been very easy for me to tell other people, you should charge more for that. Why don't you charge more? Raise your
Right.
prices. Well, it's one thing to say that when you're talking about somebody else's business. It's another thing to do it when it's your business. And
Right.
when I had to try to set prices for, my endeavor, I learned what a big difference it is. I mean, I kind of knew it, but you don't really know it until you feel it in your gut. And there's a big difference between observing what other people do and then trying to do it yourself. But the one thing I will say is I waited a long time to do this, and I I shouldn't be given too much credit for this. I think the people who do this early on, or when they're starting out, they have families and they have mortgages and all that. I mean, I have a family and I have a mortgage, but my kids are out of school, and that changed the the calculation in a big
Right.
way. So yeah, I'm still scared, but it's not as scary as it would have been 10 years ago.
Right. Right. What do you think? I mean, again, you've talked to hundreds and hundreds of business owners and entrepreneurs. I mean, what do you think is kind of the key ingredient to their success? I mean, um, you know, you see it all, all the time in different ways. I'm just curious if do you think there is, that kind of people are born to be entrepreneurs, and or do you think they can learn it? What's your take?
That's such an interesting question, and I don't know that it'll ever be thoroughly resolved, and I certainly don't have the definitive answer. But I would tell you this: I've especially learned a lot in the last 2 years, because I've been doing this regular podcast where I talk to the same group of 8 business owners every week. I talk to 3 of them every week. And we started doing this before the pandemic. We had no idea the pandemic was coming. We had no idea how interesting things were going to get. But I've had these conversations with them every week through this incredibly difficult period. Thankfully, things are looking up now, but there were times, especially early on, where it was not at all clear that these businesses were going to survive. And I saw it through their eyes. I saw what they dealt with, and they talked about it. It's just been an incredible education to have the privilege to talk to them on this regular basis. I think, to answer your question, that experience has just really taught me that there is no one answer. I think the key is being flexible, being,
Right.
Open to suggestion and ready to move in whatever direction makes sense. And I guess related to that, I think one of the things that I see a lot of entrepreneurs struggle with is they have to be kind of incredibly stubborn just to get a business off the ground. I mean, a lot of people are going to tell you, you're crazy. Why would you walk away from a career or whatever it is to do this? You don't need to take this risk. You don't need to borrow against your house. What are you thinking? What are you doing? So it takes a certain kind of person to do that. And maybe a little bit of that is something you have to be born with, just to have the stomach to do that. But then what's tricky is at a certain point, you have to open yourself up to the experiences of others and to learn from the mistakes that others make, and maybe lose some of that stubbornness. At a certain point, you have to decide, yeah, I got myself this far, but if I'm going to keep going, I may have to bring in some other people who have different experiences. I may have to be open to different ways of doing things. That's a really difficult trick. And I think, the pandemic taught a lot of people that they just had to be, ready to try anything.
Right. Yeah. No, I mean, the word, it's been dramatically overused, but that word pivot is definitely come into play many, 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 many times for many business owners over the last 18 months.
But even an interesting twist on that is sometimes you have to have the nerve not to pivot. And I saw a couple of businesses that dealt with that, who saw everybody else pivoting and said, you know what, the reasons why this doesn't make sense for my business, and even though everybody is telling me I should pivot, I'm not going to do it. And I'm happy to say that a couple of business owners that I talk to regularly stuck to their guns, and in the end, we're very glad they did.
Yeah. No, it's fascinating to see how that's happened. And some organizations haven't really had to change at all. outside of, maybe, just safety protocols during the height of COVID. But, and then others, I know have changed their business model, and it's going to be that way forever. And,
Right.
it's better now than it ever was.
Well, that's one of the things I mean, I don't want to say I've enjoyed this period because it's been so difficult and, really difficult for a lot of people. But one of the things that's been interesting to cover as a journalist is the silver linings. I mean, there are so many things that we do now that we didn't do before, and I think we'll keep doing. And if it hadn't been for the pandemic, I doubt you and I would be having this conversation.
Right.
But I think we're probably going to keep doing things like this, and that's a good thing.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's true. So, taking that last question I asked you and kind of flipping it around, when I mean, in all your years of talking to business owners, you've seen those significant challenges, and I'm sure you've seen a lot of business owners that have actually gone out of business. What do you think, those kind of common threads are, as far as, the things that people run into, or the challenges that small business owners have that, that they can overcome?
I do think I mentioned it before, but the biggest thing that I see people struggle with really is pricing. There's an art to it. It's so hard, and the fear that people have if you price too high that everybody is just going to go away. That
Right.
How do you shake that fear? I mean, it's impossible. Who would not have that fear? But you have to overcome it sometimes. And I think there are a lot of businesses out there, especially businesses that involve a certain amount of art and creativity. It could be a restaurant. It could be some kind of actually one of the people on my podcast has a picture framing business, so that it's directly related to art. In businesses like those, people, they're used to they must do something really well, or they wouldn't have gotten the business off the ground. But pricing what they do is just, it's for a lot of people, it's just not part of their experience, and they struggle with it. And you can really cause yourself a lot of trouble if you don't price well. For example, I mean, if you're doing something really well, you might have a lot of business. You might be selling a lot of something or serving a lot of people, but you can drive yourself crazy. You'll be too busy, and you're not making enough money. Whereas if you just raised your prices a little bit, you wouldn't be quite as busy. You'd enjoy it more. You'd probably do a better job, and maybe you could hire someone.
Right.
It's I think that's the thing I see over and over again.
Yeah, no, it's true. It's, you definitely, it is that kind of fine art. And I do see, in the franchise world, we see a lot of people that, just struggle through, keeping their margins very, very, very low. And, and to your point, like, if you just raise your price a little bit, yeah, it might have some impact on the total business, but it'll be much more profitable, be able to grow, so on and so forth.
But most of the people I talk to who finally do pull the trigger and raise their prices are really glad they did and can't believe they didn't do it sooner. And one of the things they discover is that oftentimes, yeah, they do lose some business, but they lose their worst customers most of the time. The people who
Right.
they didn't really need, who are a little bit more trouble. And that's a positive.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's true. So I know you cover, all sorts of different businesses, different sizes all over the place. Not as many in the franchise world. When you look at the franchise world, I guess, what intrigues you, what interests you about, the franchise segment?
Well, I'll tell you two things. One is I know that there's that built-in tension between the franchisees and the franchisors.
Right.
And
Right.
I think that's really fascinating. And I know it can get really ugly, and there's a lot of litigation in some places, and which is a shame. But there are a lot of really interesting stories there, and that tension can be, for example, I know I've talked to many, there are franchisees who do things right by the book. They do exactly what they're told. And there are others that want to, kind of make it their own and
Experiment a little bit.
exactly. And some franchisors are willing to let them do that, and some aren't. And I find all of that really fascinating. I'll also tell you this. For a time, was a business reporter at the Columbus Dispatch in Columbus, Ohio. And I was there at an interesting time. It was shortly after Wendy's had been founded in Columbus by Dave Thomas and kind of exploded and made a bunch of people in Columbus millionaires pretty quickly. Right. And it was a really interesting time because there's kind of a franchising gold rush in the years that followed, because anybody who had an idea for a fast food franchise could raise money for it at that point, because nobody wanted to miss the next Wendy's. And there are all these chains that came up that no longer exist. Most of them failed fairly quickly. But as a business reporter, it was a really interesting experience to cover that.
Yeah, I can imagine it was like the Wild West back then. And and I think there's even some of that still today, is that, somebody's following, some other brand, and you see these different hubs around the country that turn into kind of franchise hubs, because certain people will leave one organization and start their own concept. Right. And then the next thing you know, there's a couple dozen in town. And
exactly.
Yeah, it's interesting that you talk about the franchise relationship, because, that's what franchising is all about. It's, a lot of people use the analogy of marriage. You're signing a contract with someone, and, who are you getting into business with? As you know, business partnerships are always challenging. And so really understanding who the company is, who the leadership is, what are their goals? Do they align with your goals as a franchisee? And that stuff changes over time. So, and that's really kind of where our expertise comes in, and really kind of digesting that, what is going on behind the scenes with that relationship between franchisees and franchisor. Because, at the end of the day, life's too short to be in business when you're angry, and, you don't want to be fighting people. And, so understanding that relationship, and really, I think it's really twofold, though. It's looking at both the franchisor and the franchisee, and obviously what that relationship is like, but then also, what's the franchisee community like? Because, similar to your own business, where you have entrepreneurs sharing best practices and all that information. The best franchise organizations are like that at the network level too. So the franchisees are getting together and sharing ideas constantly. But not every franchise organization is like that. Some are much more, kind of keep to themselves, and, maybe they'll go to the annual conference once a year, but other than that, there's not a lot of interaction. So I think, and that's what really, when I first found 21 Hats, literally a month or so ago, I was just blown away by, what you've built as far as that community of entrepreneurs and business owners, that, there's a certain kind of mindset in, just sharing what you've learned, and knowing that you can always learn more, and, basically small business owners helping each other out. And, again, that's not a culture you see everywhere. And I think it's, you've done a great job of building that at 21 Hats, and it's interesting to see that.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate your saying that. I think one of the things that the communities have in common, maybe, and you know much more about this than I do, but I'd be eager to hear your perspective on it. I think there's a natural competitive streak among entrepreneurs, especially with larger businesses. So, in among the entrepreneurs I talk to, at some level, they're all competing with Amazon, or
right.
They all have, or they have, smaller competitors, but they're backed by private equity, so they have more resources. And I think uh, again, you know much more about this than I do, but I think that's true in the franchising model as well, where it's much, more difficult for a smaller business owner to get involved in certain franchised businesses because there's so much competition from private equity businesses. And
Right, right.
I think that's an interesting tension point as well.
Yeah, no, it's definitely, private equity has come into the franchise segment, full bore over the last decade. And certainly that changes the dynamic at certain franchise brands. And, there's a number of different franchise, really private equity or franchise focused private equity firms that really understand that value of the franchisee franchisor relationship and do it well. Um, and then there's others that just come in and it's all about the money, and and that never ends well for
Right.
franchisees in that organization. So again, it's important to kind of understand who are the players, what's that kind of chain of command look like. And obviously the thing about franchising that is attractive for many that want to get into business ownership is it's entrepreneurship, but it's kind of entrepreneurship with a cheat sheet, if you will. So you hopefully have a proven business model and proven systems and a proven brand, and you can kind of plug and play and follow the game plan. And so it makes I don't want to say it's makes it easy, certainly. Owning any small business is challenging, but it makes it a little bit easier, certainly from scratch, starting a business from scratch.
But that's also there are a lot of different kinds of cheat sheets, and you're
Right.
one of those cheat sheets as well. I mean, I think that's one of the real attractive things about franchising compared to owning other businesses. It's not just the information that the franchisor gives you. There are places you can go to get industry data like your business,
Right.
and make sure you know what you're jumping into.
Right. Right. Yeah. And I would say the same thing about you as well, because 21 Hats, I think, is a great resource for franchisees and any business owner, certainly, as far as being able to find that information about whatever it is. I mean, obviously the world has changed a lot in the last 18 months, as we've said. And if you're not part of a group, CEO group or franchise group or something where you can't get that information easily, it's good to have those resources.
I think that really is important. It's, you know, even if you're a franchisee, but especially if you're, out on your own as a business owner, it can just be really lonely. Who do you talk to when things aren't going well? You can't really talk
Right.
to your employees. You may not be able to talk to your spouse. Your friends probably have, I mean, depending who your friends are, they may be very smart, but they may have no idea what it takes to build or run a business. Where do you
Right.
turn? And I think it's so important to kind of find your group, find your tribe,
Yeah. Yeah.
and learn from other people's mistakes if at all possible.
Exactly. Exactly. All right. So for my final question here, I'm going to ask you to take out your crystal ball. We've been through hell the last 18 months. You talk to a lot of different people. What do you see happening out there in the world, and where do you think we're going in 2022?
Well, first, let me say, it wasn't that long ago that when inflation was starting to pick up a little bit, and there was this talk about whether it was transitory or whether it was real and it was going to stick around. And I believe the people who said it was transitory and that we wouldn't have to worry about it very long. So I just want to throw that out there for anybody who might want to pay attention to what I'm saying. You should know I've been pretty wrong pretty recently. That aside, I still believe that we're kind of headed in the right direction. I think, for example, I was doing this kind of thing 10 years ago when we were coming out of the Great Recession. And I think we're in a better place now than we were then. That just dragged on for so long. And,
Right.
if inflation is scary right now, but it's the result of strong demand. And that's a good thing. And I think some of that inflation will prove to be transitory, not as much as I had thought or hoped, but I think that will ease up at some point. And as things move back towards normal a little bit, I think the economy is pretty well set up for a lot of people to do well. So that's, maybe it's wishful thinking. I mean, we've all been through such a difficult time, but I think, between the treatments and the vaccines, I think COVID is becoming more manageable, and I think the economy is poised. And I like to think we're in for a pretty good year. We've certainly earned it.
Yeah, no, for sure. Yeah, it's interesting. Obviously there's been a lot of talk about the great resignation, and, the workplace has obviously changed forever. And, certainly I think there's more people than ever before thinking about, entrepreneurship or owning their own business or the gig economy, whatever that may be. So I agree. I'm optimistic that 2022 is going to be, a good year for small business. And I think especially, for individuals that, whether it's franchising or starting a business from scratch, there's so many more opportunities out there now than ever before. And it's, that entrepreneurial mindset, along with that, just, that work-life balance, whatever you want to call it, just, I think the silver lining of COVID is it's given us this, what is our bigger purpose here? Not just work.
Absolutely.
And so, how do you do everything and with that balance? And so I agree. I'm optimistic, and I think that we're going to see a big boom over the next, 5-10 years with small business ownership in many different forms.
I think so too. And to your point, I think we've learned so much, and I think there were things that we didn't think would work, that we didn't even try, and now we know they do work. And I would like to think that not only will business be good, but there's the potential to enjoy life a lot more. We can, I don't know that I believe work-life balance exists, but
Right.
there are always going to be trade-offs, but we might be able to make some better trades and
Right.
do it in a way that makes us all a little bit happier.
Awesome. Well, Loren, I thank you again for your time today and wish you the best of success with 21 Hats. And I don't know if you've got any, upcoming events, or I know, people can find you at 21hats.com.
No upcoming events yet, but I'm hoping in the coming year, as winter starts to recede and things are getting back to normal, I hope we will be having some physical events. But this has really been a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me, Eric.
No, thank you.